It's time for us to check back in with a thread that runs so true. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Lester Larks had driven us over the Rock Creek boulders up a shallow stream that shone brilliantly in the autumn sunlight. We had looked at this ribbon of water until there were spots before our eyes. Lester had driven us where few other cars had been, for the rock-ribbed hills came down to the stream. There wasn't any place for a road except in the middle of the stream, and the cars before us had traveled it only when the stream was dry in summer. The few autumn rains had not caused the stream to rise enough to drown our engine. We had reached Upper Rock Creek Rural School. This was our 6th and last school for the 2nd day. "Don't see how in the world Sophia can stand to live in this forsaken place," said Lester, who knew my sister well. "She must have been in love to marry a man and live here," Lester laughed jovially. "It'd certainly take a good-looking gal to hold me in this forsaken hole." We left the car in the creek bed with the swift blue water flowing around us and stepped on big boulders until we reached dry land. Then we went up a little bank to the schoolhouse. When we walked in, the teacher arose from her seat and faced us, and she was beautiful. She had soft brown hair and large blue eyes. She didn't wear any makeup, but her lips were as red as October sourwood leaves. Her desk was loaded with apples, wild grapes, and pawpaws, gifts her pupils had brought her. "Miss Benion, I'm Jesse Stuart," I said. "I've come to visit your school." "You're our new superintendent," she said. "I've heard about you, and I know your sister, Mrs. Kennelly, very well. See, I followed her to this school." "Have you been here that long?" I asked. 5 years, she laughed. "Your trustees must like you," I joked. "They wouldn't let me leave if I wanted to," she said. "My pupils wouldn't either." Then I looked over a schoolroom filled with 50 or more handsome pupils. Girls were on one side, boys were on the other. "Miss Benion, I'm Lester Larks," Lester said as he came forward and introduced himself. "I drive Mr. Stuart over the county to visit schools." "I've heard of you. Baseball pitcher, aren't you?" she said. "Right," Lester beamed. The boys had heard of Lester too, for they started whispering to each other. "And Mr. Stuart, I've never seen you, but you don't need any introduction here," Olive Benion said, turning to me. "We first heard talk of you when Winston High School defeated Lansboro High School in a scholastic contest. Pupils, this is Jesse Stuart, Superintendent of Greenwood County Schools. We'd like to have him speak to us." I didn't have long to speak, for it was only a few minutes until the school day ended. When I had finished talking, Olive Benion dismissed school. The pupils swarmed around us. They wanted to meet Lester, and they wanted to meet me. Finally, they departed, going up steep paths in many directions. A few wore brogan shoes. The majority of them were still barefoot. While Lester and Olive talked, I looked over the schoolhouse. It was in worse condition than the Mountain View schoolhouse. There were holes in the walls. It looked ready to fall apart. But Miss Benion kept the schoolroom very clean. The walls were decorated with autumn leaves and flowers. The tiny yard, where 50 pupils played, was clean too. This schoolhouse was typical of so many of the rural schoolhouses I had visited in Greenwood County. Inside the schoolroom, Lester and Miss Benion were still talking and laughing. "This house needs painting badly," Miss Benion said. "I wish we had the money to paint it," I said. "I'd love to have every rural school in this county repaired and painted. They're all going to seed." Before we left, Olive Benion invited us to come to the Rock Creek Singing School that evening. Lester had told her that we were spending the night at my sister's home. She went down the path above the shallow Blue Rock Creek waters that lashed white spray of foam against the boulders. After she had turned the last bend and was out of sight, Lester followed me to the car. "I've seen many beautiful women," he confessed. "Olive Benion is the prettiest girl I ever saw. I could fall in love with her. I believe I am in love with her. She's prettier than any woman I ever saw on the screen." "But you thought Lucinda Sprouse, the teacher at Mount Carmel, was beautiful too," I reminded him. "You've raved about her since we visited her school." "Oh boy, but this Olive Benion," he said, "just to have Olive Benion in my arms," he sighed as he kept his eyes fastened on the stream of water before us, "would be a greater thrill than winning the championship of Harlan County's Coal Miners' League." "Think you could live the rest of your days here with her in this forsaken hollow?" I asked. "Could if I couldn't persuade her to leave with me," he said. "Hank wouldn't leave with Sophia," I said. "These people love this narrow valley, their rock-ribbed hills, and the song of water over rocks that lulls them to sleep at night. My sister wants to move where there are better schools for her children when they grow up, but Hank won't leave." My sister couldn't believe her eyes when we drove up in front of her little cottage with a car. She and Hank and their 2 little girls greeted us. Sophia asked me about Dad and Mom and the family. She didn't get home very often, though she lived not more than 30 miles from us. During the winter, when Rock Creek was landlocked, she never came home at all. We heard from her only by letter. A telephone was unheard of in this country. When Lester and I sat down at the table, we stopped worrying about how people on Rock Creek lived. After supper, while we sat and talked, Blake Pennington, one of the trustees of the Upper Rock Creek Rural District, came to the house and called Hank outside. Blake said something to Hank, then Hank called Lester and me outside. "School teachers want dates with you fellows," Hank laughed. "Blake Pennington here was afraid to ask you. I told him I would. Ain't it right, Blake? 2 teachers are dying to have dates with them." "It sure is," Blake said seriously. "That's why I'm here. When Miss Olive wants anything, I always do it. She's a perfect mother to the little ones, and all she has to do to the big boys is smile at 'em once. Best teacher in Greenwood County, and I don't bar none. She's as decent and honorable as she is pretty." "She's the one for me," Lester shouted. "I agree with you, Mr. Pennington. I agree with every word you've said." "I'm sorry to disappoint you, young man," Blake said, "but she wants to date her superintendent. She wants him to take her to the singing school." Lester looked at me. He looked at Hank. Disappointment clouded his ruddy complexioned face. "Lucinda Sprouse of the Mount Carmel School fell for you today," Blake told Lester. "She thinks you're the best-looking young man she's ever seen." "What do you say about it, Stuart?" Lester said. "Let the teachers choose," I said. "I'm satisfied." Then Lester reluctantly consented to take Lucinda. "At 7:30, you will meet the girls in the Upper Rock Creek schoolyard and go inside with them," Blake directed us. "It's too late for you to go to their homes and get them. Besides, you don't know where they live." "That's all right with us," I said. "We'll be there, won't we, Lester?" "Sure," he answered in a subdued tone. "We'll see you this evening," Blake Pennington said as he hurried away. At 7:30, Lester and I were back at the schoolhouse. Lucinda Sprouse and Olive Benion arrived just as we did. Lester took Lucinda by the arm, and they walked in front of Olive and me into the schoolhouse. When we walked inside, all eyes were turned upon us. The house was packed to capacity, and Blake Pennington was up front with his tuning fork in his hand. He turned his back to the audience and faced his choir, a mixed group of men, women, boys, and girls. He registered the tune on his tuning fork. For 2 hours, we heard this choir sing hymns and folk songs. They sang beautifully, even if the choir members didn't know a note of music. And often the people in the audience sang with the choir. When everybody sang, I thought the singing was as beautiful as a high wind among the winter oak tops. So many people often turned towards Lester and me, strangers in their midst, that it seemed they were singing for us. It was 9:30 when the singing school was over and we left the schoolhouse. Lester and Lucinda went up a path along one of Rock Creek's narrow-gauged tributaries. It was not in the direction of Mount Carmel. I didn't have far enough to go to take Olive home. We walked along the path beside the ruffled waters of Rock Creek until we came to a very large log house. This was the house where Olive Benion was born and where she had lived all her life, except for 4 9-month periods when she had been in the Moorhead Training School. She invited me inside. There I met her father and mother and her brothers and sisters, all younger than Olive. After we had talked for an hour or more, Mrs. Benion served hot biscuits, wild honey, and coffee. She also served homemade pickles at intervals to take the taste of wild honey from our mouths. Then Olive and I went into the parlor, a big room with an open fireplace and a blazing wood fire. Here we had the late evening all alone. The room was spacious and beautiful, and Olive was beautiful too in the soft glow of firelight. I wondered if Greenwood County's superintendent of schools should be dating one of his teachers. Then I decided the position that I held shouldn't interfere with personal affairs. It was about midnight when I said goodnight to Olive and left the Benions. While I was walking up the path with pleasant thoughts of an evening well spent, a pistol barked 6 times from somewhere near the schoolhouse. I had to pass the schoolhouse to get to my sister's. At least I thought I did. Another pistol was emptied in my direction. The bullets went high. I heard 2 hit among the black oak branches above my head and sing off into space. I didn't have time to think what to do. Pistols barked again. Dirt flew up in the starlit path ahead of me. I started running for my life. Not in the direction of the schoolhouse either. I went back the way I had come. Now I heard the screams of my pursuers. There must have been a 6 men after me. I ran part of the way back to Benion's. I had made for the steep hill. I ran like a fox over the autumn leaves that carpeted the earth. After my pursuers got away from the noise of the singing waters, they could hear me in the leaves. I think they must have shot in the direction of the sound, for bullets whizzed by too close for safety. I got behind a big oak high on the mountainside, and I let them shoot. More than once, oak bark flew all around me. I let them shoot until I thought they had wasted their bullets. Then I walked as softly as a cat around the steep hill slope until I reached Hank's cow pasture, and I went down the back way to the house. When I got home, it was 2:30. My clothes were ruined. There was a hole torn in the back of my coat. I thought my pant leg just below my knee was ripped in 2 places until I discovered a bullet had gone in and had come out again. I was so scared I didn't know when it had happened. When Lester got back at 3:30, I was in bed. He woke me. "Look at me," he said after he lit the lamp. "You're a lucky dog." There was a pump knot on his forehead, big as a guinea's egg. His face was red with blood. "What happened to you, fellow?" I asked. "I was rocked," he said. "First I stood my ground. I threw rocks at them fast as bullets. Must have upended a 6 the way they screamed. But there was too many of them. They hit me with 3 rocks. One nearly busted a panel of ribs, and one caught me squarely behind. Then I realized it was time for me to take off." "Did you have a good time?" I asked. "Oh, I had a wonderful time taking Lucinda home," Lester said. "Had to walk 4 or 5 miles. She lives in a place you ought to see. Rock Creek is a paradise compared to the place where she lives." "You didn't get rocked all the way home, did you?" I asked. "Just the last 2 miles," he said. "Was lucky it wasn't all the way. I know you had a good time." "That's right," I said. After breakfast, I wore Hank's clothes while Sophia darned mine. "What happened to your clothes?" Lester inquired as he watched my sister darn holes. "You got off easy last night," I said. "Rocks are easier to dodge than bullets." Lester laughed as I had never heard him laugh before. He must have thought he had been richly rewarded by not dating the teacher of his choice, since he had only been hit with 3 rocks and I had come so close to the call. "Lester, I don't think it's anything to laugh about," Sophia said. "Just an inch closer, that bullet might have made Jesse a cripple for life. He might have lost his leg. I think it's funny when the superintendent of Greenwood County Schools gets a bullet in his pant leg when he has a date with one of his teachers." Lester screamed with laughter. "I told Hank after you boys left last night," Sophia said, "that something might happen. The young men around here are awfully funny about strangers coming in here and dating their girls. 4 or 5 young men in this district are in love with Olive Benion." We'll stop right there for today. I really like this part, but what another mess that Jesse and their Lester too in this part has found theirself in. If you remember all the way back several readings ago where we read where it was actually the first school Jesse was at when the gentleman set him up with the teacher, and kind of the same thing happened. It wasn't bullets that time, it was rotten tomatoes and squash and stuff like that, but they threw a big gang of men come after him and threw at him, and boys, and I guess she's right that people are awful particular about who comes in and dates their young ladies. As always, I wrote down a few things to talk about, but right here at the end, I didn't write this out. I love that he says there was a pump knot on his forehead big as a guinea's egg. That's something I've heard my whole life. So a pump knot, it's hard for me. I've heard people say they didn't know what that was, and I'm like, okay, well, how do I describe what a pump knot is? Because it's a pump knot. It's one of those things. But it's if you get hit in your head and a knot comes up, that's a pump knot. And you can get them from people throwing rocks at you. You might get them because you run into something. Of course, if you're in a car wreck or something like that, it makes me think of little kids too. They fall down, and sometimes there's a pump knot. A pump knot comes up, and sometimes it's big as a guinea's egg. So that was one of the things here. And then the rocked part, I was rocked. So, today we might say, because somebody threw rocks at me. Somebody was throwing rocks at me. But that rocked, just used as a term for actually what went on, that was really common in those days. And like I would hear Pap say that the boys that he played with when he was a little boy, they thought that was a fun game to rock each other. They'd have wars and they'd rock each other. Doesn't sound very fun to me, but I like that usage though there. Now, when it starts out in this part, the Upper Rock Creek School, how they're getting there, driving through the creek, is just as pretty as the one that we read about last week. Can you just see that beautiful, beautiful creek? And Jesse really describes it good. It sounds like it was what we would say a bold creek. In other words, it was really moving along and really had some power behind it. The little creek that I live by, Stamy Creek, it's not a bold creek. It just meanders along slowly. Even if there's if we've had a lot of rain and it's really moving, I still wouldn't really call it a bold creek because it's not usually like that. It's usually more of a just gentle stream, gentle little creek, and it's not very big. You certainly couldn't drive a car in it. Although now that I say that, I think my Uncle Henry drove his truck up at one time part way. Anyway, it's not a bold creek like Jesse was describing there where they lived. I loved how 2 or 3 places he described the white foam, and then he said it was ruffled, the foam, the white places in it. So it was a pretty good sized little stream, I'm sure. And the drive just sounded just as beautiful as the one from last week. Now, when they meet Olive there, and I think the first time I said her name, I might have called her Olivia. If I did, I apologize, but it is Olive. Somehow I got Olivia in my mind. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I said Olive every time, but if I said Olivia, it is Olive. But I love how they described her, how he described her, and you could see Lester was just in love with her immediately. But he was talking about her makeup and that she didn't wear any makeup, but yet her lips, I loved how he described them as being red as sourwood leaves in the fall. I don't know if on the camera if it's showing up, but I've got lots of little sourwood saplings growing on the bank here. There's sourwood trees along the top edge of the bank in different places, but a lot of those little bitty ones that we'll never let grow into trees as long as me and Matt's here, they're beautiful right now because as I look out through there, they're all red. The leaves have all turned red on them already. So I loved that part. Interesting, too, that we find out Jesse's sister, Sophia, that she lived here, and when Olive says that she followed her there, I think that was the school maybe that Sophia taught at. You can remember he's told us before in some of these writings that his sister was also a school teacher. Of course, she was at the very first place where the men beat her up, the boys, Guy, and I don't know if Ova really did any beating, but it was Guy that did that, blacked her eyes and sent her home. And then the little school there, though, the Rock Creek School, he finds out it's in worse shape than the one we read about last week. It's not only got where you can see into the studying, he says it's actual holes in the walls. And that makes you wonder. So she says she had been there 5 years, and then the gentleman that comes to tell them the teachers want to go on a date with them, he says he would do anything for Olive. He would do anything. Well, the first thing I think of is, well, why don't you fix the holes in the wall of the school, And then I also thought, well, when winter comes, even if they've got a wood stove in there, those holes, do they stuff them with rags or something? Do they stuff something in them to keep the air coming? It's, of course, anytime you're reading this, anytime you're looking back in the history of whatever you're talking about, whether it's this area or some other area of the United States or even around the world, of course you can always say people were different then, and we've said that certainly, and I have over and over and over. But I think this is another good example. People in those days just didn't worry about everything being perfect like we do today, They just didn't. They just made do with what they had, and they were used to that, and like today, we'd be like, I would never have a schoolhouse that had a hole in it. Well, they just didn't even think about it. It just didn't, I don't know. And I don't think it was because, like I've heard some people say, well, it's because they were lazy or less than or something like that. I don't think it was any of those things. If they were lazy, they wouldn't have got to that school and they wouldn't stay in that hard area there where they were living. I think it was just that they thought about stuff differently than we do. It just didn't occur to them that they should, So maybe that was part of it, that they knew there was holes in it, but she kept the inside neat and nice, and her students were good, and they brought her all the things that she had decorating there, and then they were all really polite to Lester and Jesse, so, it was just something that didn't bother them. I think it's amazing that there was 50 students. You think about the rural nature of where they've described how they had to drive up the creek there to get to it, and I think it's amazing there was 50 kids. 50 kids, that's really, really impressive. Another term I liked that Jesse used in that part when he's talking about, she says she wished that she could paint the school, and he says, well, he wished as superintendent he could repair and paint all the rural schools, but he says they're all going to seed. You don't hear that much anymore, but that's certainly really common in my growing up years. They're all going to seed. And it's such a descriptive thing when you think about it. If you, as a gardener, when things go to seed, it's typically at the end of the gardening season or it's always at the end of that plant's life when it goes to seed, and it's tattered and it's torn, and maybe it's got some bug damage and it's all brown and all that. So it's just a really apt description for things that are in disrepair, like this school building that he's talking about. And then, of course, it is comical, the part Lester, he seems like such a nice guy, but also really comical in a way that he just immediately fell over, head over heels in love with Olive, and he even watched her till she went out of sight. I would like to have seen that. Of course, like Jesse reminds him, well, you just earlier were just going crazy over Lucinda at the other school, but he says, oh, this is different, Olive's even prettier. So I just thought that was funny. I really love, though, when during that part, as they're going back and forth about Olive when she's walked off to go home, Jesse tells him, well, do you think she's pretty enough that you'd live here? Because she's likely not to leave. She's not going to leave. So then he says, kind of tells him, that's the same thing that's happened to my sister, Sophia. She married Hank, and she would like for Hank to move somewhere else so that it's easier, I'm sure, but he says better schools. But he says Hank won't leave. He's not leaving this place. So I bet Olive would have been the same way. But then Jesse goes into talking about how the people that live in that area, how they've become, that Bold Creek has almost become part of them, and they're used to hearing the sound, and it lulls them to sleep at night, and it's just part of their life, and they're never going to leave it. Well, that really speaks to the sense of place lots of people in Appalachia have that live in different places. I have that about where I live here. Now, as a believer, I say I have to do what God wants me to do. So if he ever wanted me to leave, it'd be really, really hard, but I just have to do that. But as far as for my personal self, I couldn't imagine, living somewhere else. And certainly not, even if I had to leave Wilson Holler, leaving Appalachia, leaving the mountains, leaving the culture, that would be really, really hard, even harder. But that sense of place is really, really strong part of Appalachian culture. And I have a video about it if you've not seen it, where I really go into detail and tell what I think causes that. And I will link to that and then put it in the description below. And I won't go into that now, but I liked that. That's what Jesse's pointing out, is that Hank won't leave, and Olive probably won't leave either. So would you live here in this forsaken place? Because Lester had also said on the way in, this is a forsaken hole, so he's saying, would you really live here? Of course, Lester says, I sure would if I could live with her. And then they do get to go on the dates with them, and Lester has to settle for Lucinda. But then I love the description of them going back and going inside and the singing. Oh man, I wish I could have been there to hear that beautiful singing. And I love Jesse's description when he says it sounded like a high wind among the winter oak tops. Oh, I just love that. Beautiful imagery. If you live in a place where the seasons change like I do, oaks are the last ones to lose their leaves. They're the last trees, so they keep their leaves much, much longer than other trees. But the wind, whether it's in the winter in those more barren trees, or if the oaks still have their leaves and they're kind of making some noise, even in the trees like it is today, the wind is a magical thing, a beautiful thing. I'm enamored with the wind. Of course, I don't like the wind that tears up stuff. Like Jesse last week was worried the wind would come and blow that schoolhouse off the mountain. I'm not interested in those winds, but just the soft wind, or even the more fierce wind that don't really do any damage. It's just something really to marvel at. So I loved that description. I loved it. And I like I said, I wish I was there. I wish I could have heard those beautiful, they said they sung gospel songs, they sung folk songs, and the men and women, boys and girls, everybody sung together, and he just said it was amazing. And then so many people was looking at them since they were the newcomers. Probably some of those people was plotting what was about to happen to them, but he didn't realize that at the time, but that they felt like they were singing to them. I just love that. But I really love the specialness of just that was the excitement, entertainment, was just everybody got together and sung. That's so amazing. Again, we don't live in those days today. There's certainly singing still in my area. The community building I've told y'all about before has in the summer months, like from March maybe to October, they have a Saturday night singing once a month, and they sell hot dogs and hamburgers, and it's nice, but it's not packed like that. It's not packed to capacity. And there's churches that has singings, and of course they draw in people. Of course there's concerts, you think about famous people having them. But when I was a girl, there was lots of churches would do this and have singings, and there would be 3 or 4 groups, and it would literally be, like he said, it would just be capacity. There'd be nowhere to, people be standing around the edges of the church house. There'd be people outside talking on the porch that'd kind of come and go, and there'd be kids laid out asleep in people's laps. I was probably one of those kids a lot of times, but it was just a different time, and there was less entertainment and less things to draw our attention to. That's one of the sad things that we've lost, I think, is because we have so much. We live in the land of plenty. Even from the time I was a girl, which ain't been that long till today, so much more plentiful. Everything you need is. And more entertainment, more things to do, but then we've lost those. I think about those church services, or even if it was a community service or a ball game or something at school. It's just not as, doesn't, I guess there's so many other things to pull your attention that not as many people go to those things, and they're not at capacity like this one Jesse's describing. And then the very last part, you know, being chased by the men again that was jealous of Jesse and Lester. And I don't know, I mean, I guess the worst is Jesse, because they were shooting at him, so any bullet could have killed him. Even if they didn't mean to, they could have accidentally killed him. But what a night. And then that it took him so long to go through the woods and figure out how to get back to Hank's pasture, and then kind of come down the back way, and it tore up his clothes. And then, of course, the image of Lester coming in even later and then making Jesse get up, you know, saying, I guess you had it easy, you know, because he's still jealous that Jesse got to take Olive and he had to take Lucinda. But then he finds out, well, I just had to deal with rocks. I didn't have to deal with bullets, so he feels a little bit better. But I love the part, I mean, it's sad, but I mean, I hate it happened to him, but I love how Jesse described, he says, Lester is saying, since he had only been hit with 3 rocks, but then I had been, Jesse's saying about himself, I had come so close to the call. I had come so close to the call. He just, it's just a descriptive language, the way he's using that, but it's like, I don't know, I can't even describe it exactly, but what call he's talking about, it, of course, is being called home by the Lord, death calling him. He had been so close to the call. But just the way he says that is like the finality of it. That is the one call that we all have to answer. You know, we'll all be, as a believer, of course, held accountable and all the rest of that goes with it. But even if you're not a believer, that's the call that none of us can escape, is that call, you know, the call to be called out of this world. And I just love the finality and the simplicity, I guess, of how he said that I had come so close to the call, like there was no other call that you could even talk about. That's the call, the one, you know. So I really, really loved that part. And then the ending of it, you got to love Lester. Sophia tells him it's not funny, you know, when he's laughing at Jesse, but that just makes him laugh more. He just screams with laughter, he says. He's just screaming, laughing about it. I guess it is, a lot of it is Lester thinking it's your just desserts, kind of, as we would say. You're getting what you deserve because you took Olive and I wanted to, you know, which I'm sure in the long run Lester's glad he wasn't shot at, but that's a nice place to leave it, I guess, for today, and a nice way for Jesse to end that little part. I hope that you'll leave me a comment and tell me what you liked about this part. I like it a lot. I like it almost as much as I like last week's, just because of the picture of the school and Jesse's sister being there and getting to see her, and he don't get to see her much, and she don't get to go home much, and then that wonderful sense of place around that bold creek that all those people enjoy. So I really, really love this part. I hope you'll leave me a comment and tell me what you liked, and I hope, as always, you'll drop back by next Friday so we can see what happens next.